We have prepared for this day. Our courage will lead us to victory.
Alexander thinks he can challenge me? He is no competitor to the king of Persia.
The enemy outnumbers us. What if we fall? We have Alexander. His strategy never fails. Tomorrow decides everything.
The dust had not yet settled. The screaming of 10,000 horses tore through the morning air of the Mesopotamian plain. And somewhere in that churning chaos of iron and blood and desperate men, the fate of the entire known world hung by a single, trembling thread. It is October 1st, 331 BC. The place is a vast, featureless plain near the ancient village of Gaugamela, in what is today northern Iraq, not far from the modern city of Mosul. The temperature at dawn would have been cool, almost deceptive in its calm. But by midday the sun hammered down on perhaps the largest, assembled military force the ancient world had ever seen in one place. On one side, Darius III, the King of Kings, the ruler of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the most powerful sovereign on the face of the earth, commanding an army that ancient sources like Arrian and Diodorus Siculus estimated at anywhere between 200,000 and 1 million men. Modern historians, working from more conservative and rigorous analysis, place the number at somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 soldiers. But even that conservative estimate dwarfs the number that stood opposite them. On the other side, Alexander III of Macedon, 25 years old. A king who had never lost a battle, commanding roughly 47,000 men, tired from years of campaigning, far from home, surrounded on a plain specifically designed to destroy them. By any rational calculation, by any reasonable assessment of military arithmetic, Alexander should have died that day. His army should have been swallowed whole by the Persian colossus, and history should have recorded him as a footnote. Another ambitious young man crushed beneath the eternal weight of Persian power. But history, as you already know, had other plans. What happened on that plain in the autumn of 331 BC was not merely a battle. It was the collision of two entirely different ideas about how the world should be ordered. On one side stood the accumulated weight of 200 years of Persian imperial tradition, an empire that stretched from Egypt to the borders of India, a civilization of breathtaking sophistication and terrifying military power. On the other stood something newer, hungrier, and in many ways more dangerous, a single man's absolute, almost insane conviction that the world was his to take. This is the story of Gaugamela. This is the story of the hour the world changed. And to understand why it matters, not just as a military curiosity, not just as an ancient footnote, but as a human story that speaks directly to something deep inside all of us, we have to start not with the battle itself, but with the man who designed the killing field, and why. Even with every advantage imaginable, he still lost. We have to start with Darius and the trap he built himself. Before we talk about Alexander's genius, before we celebrate the tactics and the brilliance and the legendary cavalry charge that would be studied in military academies for the next 2,000 years, we need to spend serious time with the man on the other side of that plain. Because Darius III of Persia deserves more than the dismissive treatment history has typically given him. He was not a fool. He was not weak. He was not the trembling, effeminate coward that Alexander's court historians, men like Callisthenes, who had every professional reason to flatter their employer, would later paint him as. He was a man who had survived the brutal, Byzantine politics of the Persian court, who had outmaneuvered rivals and assassins to claim the Achaemenid throne, and who, by the time he faced Alexander at Gaugamela, had already fought this young Macedonian twice before and understood, with painful clarity, exactly what he was dealing with. The first meeting had been at the Granicus River in 334 BC, in northwestern Asia Minor, which is today western Turkey. That battle had been relatively small in scale, more of a skirmish than a full engagement. Still, Alexander's forces had crossed the river under fire and shattered the Persian satrapal army defending the crossing. It was a statement of intent, brutal and unmistakable. The second meeting had been far more consequential. In November of 333 BC, at the narrow coastal pass of Issus, in the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean, Darius had personally commanded a massive Persian force and had been defeated in a way that must have felt incomprehensible. The terrain at Issus had worked against him. The narrow coastal plain had negated his numerical advantage and funneled his enormous army into a bottleneck. Where Alexander's disciplined Macedonian phalanx could operate with devastating efficiency, Darius had been forced to flee the battlefield, abandoning his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his treasury to the advancing Macedonians. At that moment, the King of Kings, abandoning his own family and running from a 22-year-old boy. That was a wound that went far deeper than military defeat. It was a wound to the idea of Persian invincibility itself. But here is what the popular history of Alexander tends to overlook. Darius did not collapse after Issus. He did not surrender. He did not accept the terms that many of his advisors surely urged him to accept. Instead, he went home, and he spent 2 years rebuilding, restructuring, and rethinking. He dispatched diplomatic missions. He offered Alexander territory, wealth, and the hand of a Persian princess in marriage. And when those offers were refused, as he probably knew they would be, he did something that reveals the full measure of his intelligence as a military commander. He chose his ground. This is the decision that defines the entire Battle of Gaugamela before a single soldier takes a single step. And it is worth dwelling on at length, because it represents one of the most sophisticated pieces of strategic thinking in ancient military history, even if it ultimately failed. Darius understood, with crystalline precision, why he had lost at Issus. The terrain, the narrow pass had neutralized his cavalry, his scythed chariots, and his overwhelming numerical superiority. The Macedonian phalanx, those terrifying blocks of infantry bristling with 18-foot sarissa spears, needed to be broken apart, needed to be outflanked and overwhelmed, and at Issus, there had simply been no room to do it. So Darius searched for a place where there would be room, an enormous amount of room. He found it at Gaugamela. The ancient sources, particularly Arrian of Nicomedia, writing in the 2nd century AD, but drawing on the contemporary account of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's own generals who was present at the battle, describe the site in terms that make the strategic logic immediately apparent. The plain was vast, flat, and almost completely treeless. There were no rivers to complicate cavalry movements, no hills to provide natural defensive positions, and no narrow passes to channel and restrict the flow of large formations. It was, in the most literal possible sense, a blank canvas on which a general with superior numbers and superior cavalry could paint a masterpiece of destruction. And Darius did not simply find this ground. He prepared it. This detail, recorded by Arrian in his Anabasis Alexandri, The most reliable ancient account of Alexander's campaigns is one of the most remarkable things about the entire battle. Darius had his engineers physically clear the ground of the battlefield, rocks, stones, and any debris that might impede the movement of his scythed chariots, those terrifying war machines fitted with blades extending from their axles. Designed to carve through infantry formations like a scythe through wheat, were removed. The ground was leveled and smoothed, as carefully as any modern construction project, specifically to allow these weapons their maximum effectiveness. Think about what that tells you about the man. He was not waiting for Alexander to come to him on whatever ground happened to be available. He was engineering the conditions of his own victory. He was building a killing field with the same deliberate, professional care that a craftsman brings to his finest work. His order of battle, reconstructed by modern historians including A.B. Bosworth in his landmark 1988 study Conquest and Empire, and by Peter Green in his Alexander of Macedon, was a masterpiece of layered power. At the center he positioned his elite infantry, including Greek mercenaries, men who fought in essentially the same style as Alexander's own troops, supplemented by the elite Persian infantry units known as the Immortals. The 10,000-strong corps that served as the backbone of Persian ground forces. Around and behind the infantry he massed his enormous cavalry, reportedly including Bactrian horsemen from Central Asia, Scythian riders from the steppes, and the elite Persian cavalry that represented the finest horse soldiers in the known world. On the flanks, he stationed the scythed chariots, ready to be unleashed against the Macedonian phalanx at the moment of maximum vulnerability. And at the center of everything, elevated on his great royal chariot, surrounded by his personal bodyguard and the cream of Persian nobility, stood Darius himself. The positioning of the king is not merely ceremonial, it is strategically crucial, and it connects directly to the central drama of the battle itself. In ancient warfare, the king was the battle. His presence on the field was the living symbol of the army's will to fight. His chariot was the command post, the rallying point, the emotional anchor of every man in the Persian ranks. As long as Darius stood firm, his army would stand firm. If Darius fell or fled, the army's will to fight would evaporate like morning dew under a summer sun. Darius knew this, Alexander knew this, and this shared understanding of the fundamental truth about ancient command structures is what would ultimately determine the outcome of the battle. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The night before the battle, the Persian camp stretched across the plain in a vast constellation of fires. Ancient sources, including Plutarch in his Life of Alexander, describe the view from the Macedonian positions as something almost incomprehensible: thousands upon thousands of campfires burning in the darkness. The distant sound of drums and prayers, and the constant movement of an army too large to ever be completely still. The Persian forces, following the military custom of many ancient armies, kept their formations lit and alert throughout the night. A deliberate display of power and readiness. Imagine standing in the Macedonian camp that night, 47,000 men looking out at what appeared to be a city of fire. Many of these men had been away from home for 3 years. They had crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, in the spring of 334 BC, and they had not stopped moving since. They had fought in Asia Minor, in Syria, in Egypt, where Alexander had visited the oracle of Ammon at Siwa and been declared, to his evident satisfaction, the son of a god. They had marched through the desert, up through Phoenicia and Judea and into Mesopotamia. And now they stood on the edge of what every man among them must have known was the decisive confrontation. They were, To put it plainly, terrified. Not all of them, of course, and not Alexander himself. But the fear was real, and it was present, and it expressed itself in the most famous strategic discussion of the entire campaign. Parmenion, Alexander's most senior general, a man who had served under Alexander's father Philip II, and who represented the voice of experienced, cautious Macedonian military tradition, came to Alexander that night with a proposal. A night attack. It made tactical sense. The Persian army was vast and complex, difficult to coordinate in daylight and far more difficult in darkness. A sudden assault under cover of night could sow confusion, disrupt the carefully prepared Persian formations, and neutralize the numerical advantage that made the open plain so dangerous. Several ancient commanders had used exactly this kind of surprise attack with devastating effect. It was not a cowardly suggestion. It was the kind of pragmatic, risk-managed thinking that had kept armies alive for generations. Alexander refused. His response, preserved by Plutarch and by Arrian, has become one of the most quoted lines in military history. Though its precise wording varies slightly between sources, the essential meaning is consistent across all versions. He would not steal his victory in the darkness. He would not win through confusion and surprise. He would face the Persian army in full daylight, on the ground they had prepared, with the numbers they had assembled. And he would defeat them in a way that left no room for doubt or qualification. The victory, when it came, would be absolute and unambiguous. But as Arrian is careful to note, and as modern historians like John Keegan in his The Mask of Command have argued compellingly, this was not mere arrogance or theatrical posturing. It was a profound piece of psychological strategy. Alexander understood that the Persian Empire did not run on military power alone. It ran on the idea of Persian invincibility, the deeply ingrained cultural and political belief, shared by subjects from Egypt to Bactria, that the Achaemenid throne was divinely sanctioned and militarily unconquerable. A nighttime victory, won through surprise and confusion, would not shatter that idea. It would merely dent it. People would say the Macedonians had been lucky, had caught the Persians sleeping, had won through trickery rather than supremacy. A victory in full daylight, against a prepared enemy on ground of their own choosing, with the whole world watching, that would shatter the idea completely. That would not just defeat the Persian army, it would defeat the Persian idea. Alexander went to sleep. This detail, the general sleeping soundly while his army lay awake in fear, is one of the genuinely extraordinary moments of the ancient record. And it tells you something essential about the kind of man Alexander was, something that goes beyond mere military brilliance. Plutarch writes that Parmenion had to come to his tent in the morning and physically wake him, that Alexander seemed almost annoyed at being roused, as though the prospect of the greatest battle of his life was less pressing than a good night's rest. Whether this is literally true, whether it is embellished by the ancient tradition of portraying great men as possessing superhuman calm, we cannot know with certainty. But the core of the story is consistent with everything else we know about Alexander's psychological profile. He had already fought the battle in his mind. He had already won it there, in the long hours of preparation and planning, and the relentless study of his enemy's strengths and weaknesses that was his constant intellectual occupation. The physical act of fighting was almost, for Alexander, a formality. The outcome had already been determined in his mind before a single sword was drawn. When he rose that morning, October 1, 331 BC, he dressed with extraordinary care. The ancient sources are specific about this. He wore his most magnificent armor, the breastplate reportedly taken as a trophy from the Battle of Issus, supplemented with a Sicilian helmet of polished steel and a tunic of extraordinary craftsmanship. His cloak was the royal Macedonian purple. His weapons were the finest available. He was not dressing for comfort or practicality. He was dressing for history. He rode along his lines, speaking to his commanders, to his companion cavalry, to the infantry officers of the phalanx, and, according to Arrian, to individual soldiers by name. This was a gift he shared with his father, the almost freakish ability to remember faces and names across an army of tens of thousands. And it was worth more than 1,000 inspiring speeches. A man whose king knows his name, remembers his service, and acknowledges his sacrifice. That man will follow his king into the kind of danger that defies rational calculation. Across the plain, the Persian army was already in position. Darius had kept his forces standing under arms through much of the night, worried about exactly the kind of night attack that Parmenion had proposed and Alexander had refused. His men were tired. Some of them had been standing in formation for hours before the battle even began. Darius, elevated on his great royal chariot at the center of his formation, could look out over an army that represented the full, terrifying breadth of the Persian Empire. To his left, Bactrian cavalry under Bessus, one of his most capable commanders. To his right, more cavalry and the scythed chariots poised to sweep across the carefully leveled ground. In front, the leveled plain that he had engineered specifically to destroy the Macedonian phalanx. Behind him, the weight of 2 centuries of Persian imperial power. He had every reason to feel confident. He had prepared this moment with extraordinary care. He had chosen the ground, prepared the ground, and assembled the greatest army in the world on that ground. And yet, if you look at the ancient accounts of Darius at Gaugamela, in Arrian, in Plutarch, in Diodorus Siculus, in Quintus Curtius Rufus, there is a consistent undercurrent of something that does not quite read as confidence. There is a quality in the descriptions of Darius that morning, in his decision-making, in his responses to the unfolding battle, that reads more like a man who has done everything right and still cannot shake the feeling that something is going to go terribly wrong. Perhaps it was the memory of Issus, the visceral, personal memory of watching his army dissolve and finding himself on a horse, galloping away from a battlefield where his own family was being taken prisoner. Perhaps it was something more instinctive, the kind of deep, animal recognition that experienced warriors sometimes describe, a sense that the man on the other side of the field is operating at a level that ordinary military calculation cannot quite account for. Whatever it was, Darius had built his perfect killing field. He had assembled his enormous army. He had leveled the ground and positioned his chariots and prepared every element of his carefully designed trap. And across the plain, adjusting the straps of his magnificent armor in the early morning light, Alexander was smiling. The trap was about to be sprung, but not in the direction Darius had planned. There is a particular quality to fear that every person reading this understands on a deeply personal level. Not the sharp, sudden fear of an immediate threat, not the flinch from a loud sound or the jolt of a near miss on the highway. The fear we are talking about here is the slower, heavier kind. The kind that settles into your chest in the quiet hours, when the noise and distraction of the day have faded, and there is nothing left between you and the full, unvarnished reality of what tomorrow is going to bring. Every man in the Macedonian camp on the night of September 30, 331 BC knew exactly what tomorrow was going to bring. And for most of them, that knowledge sat on their chests like a stone. The camp was positioned on a series of low hills, a deliberate tactical choice that gave the Macedonian commanders a clear view of the plain below. And it was that view, more than anything else, that made the night so difficult to endure. Because from those hills, every Macedonian soldier who looked south toward the Persian position saw the same thing: an ocean of fire. Arrian, drawing on Ptolemy's first-hand account, describes the sight in terms that convey its almost hallucinatory quality. The Persian campfires stretched from one edge of visibility to the other, thousands upon thousands of them. A vast, burning constellation laid out on the dark earth of Mesopotamia. The sound that accompanied those fires, the distant drums, the chanting, the prayers to Ahura Mazda and Mithra and the other deities of the Persian religious tradition. The constant movement and noise of an army that numbered, by the most conservative estimate, at least twice the size of Alexander's force. That sound carried across the plain on the night air with the kind of clarity that darkness always amplifies. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC but drawing on earlier sources including the account of Hieronymus of Cardia, adds a detail that brings the human dimension of that night into sharp focus. He writes that many of the Macedonian soldiers, veterans of 3 years of campaigning, who had crossed continents and fought in conditions that would have broken ordinary men, found themselves unable to sleep. They sat in small groups around their own fires, talking in low voices, sharpening weapons that were already sharp, writing whatever passed for letters in a world where communication across vast distances was measured in months. What did they talk about, those men, on the last night before Gaugamela? We cannot know with certainty, but we can make an educated inference from what we know about soldiers in every age and every culture. They talked about home. They talked about the people they had left behind, wives and parents and children in Macedonia, in Thessaly, in the Greek cities that had contributed contingents to Alexander's force. They talked about the battles they had already survived, the Granicus, Issus, the siege of Tyre, the long march through the desert. And they measured those previous dangers against what they could see burning on the plain below, and the arithmetic was not reassuring. Among the commanders, the anxiety expressed itself differently but no less acutely. This is where the figure of Parmenion becomes absolutely central to the story. And it is worth pausing to give this man the full attention he deserves, because he is one of the most underappreciated figures in the entire Alexander narrative. Parmenion, son of Philotas, was at this point somewhere in his late 60s. An almost incomprehensible age for an active field commander in the ancient world, and he had been fighting Macedonian wars since before Alexander was born. He had served Philip II, Alexander's father, with extraordinary distinction, helping to build the military machine that Alexander had inherited and was now deploying with such devastating effect. He was, in the most literal possible sense, the institutional memory of the Macedonian army. He knew things about logistics and supply, and the long-term sustainability of military campaigns that Alexander, for all his tactical brilliance, was still learning. He was also, by the night before Gaugamela, genuinely frightened. This is recorded with notable consistency across multiple ancient sources. Plutarch writes that Parmenion approached Alexander's tent that evening with the proposal for a night attack, and that his manner, always that of the careful, experienced professional, carried an unusual edge of urgency. The proposal itself, as we noted in our introduction, was militarily rational. Night attacks had been used effectively throughout ancient military history. The confusion of darkness would neutralize the Persian cavalry advantage, disrupt the carefully prepared formations, and give the smaller Macedonian force the kind of equalizing chaos it needed. But there was something beneath the tactical argument, something that Plutarch captures with his characteristic psychological precision. Parmenion was not merely proposing a tactical option. He was expressing, in the only language available to a professional soldier, a deeper fear that went beyond tactics. He was afraid of what would happen in the daylight. He was afraid of the open plain and the scythed chariots and the sea of Persian cavalry waiting to envelop the Macedonian flanks. He was afraid, in short, of fighting the battle exactly as Darius had designed it to be fought. And his fear was not unreasonable. It was not the fear of a coward. It was the fear of a man with 60-something years of accumulated military experience looking at a situation and calculating the odds with unsentimental clarity. The odds were not good. Alexander's response, delivered in the privacy of the command tent, with only the senior officers present, has been preserved in several versions that differ in their precise wording but agree in their essential meaning. The version in Arian reads, "I will not demean myself by stealing a victory." Alexander must defeat his enemies openly and without trickery. Plutarch's version is slightly different in phrasing but identical in spirit. Quintus Curtius Rufus, the Roman historian writing in the 1st century AD, whose account of Alexander is sometimes dismissed as rhetorically exaggerated, but contains valuable detail absent from other sources, gives the most elaborate version. A full speech in which Alexander explains his reasoning with striking specificity. What all versions agree on is the refusal and the reasoning behind it. But here is what the popular retelling of this story almost always misses, and it is the detail that matters most if you want to understand Alexander not just as a military tactician, but as a strategic thinker operating on a level that transcends the merely military. Alexander was not refusing the night attack because he was arrogant. He was refusing it because he understood something about the nature of the war he was fighting that Parmenion, for all his experience, had not fully grasped. This was not a war for territory. It was not a war for resources, or trade routes, or strategic geography, though it involved all of those things. This was a war for legitimacy. Alexander was not trying to defeat the Persian army. He was trying to replace the Persian idea, the deeply embedded cultural and political conviction, held by tens of millions of people across an empire stretching from Egypt to the borders of India, that the Achaemenid throne was the natural, divinely ordained center of the civilized world. To replace that idea, he needed to do more than win. He needed to win in a way that was unambiguous, undeniable, and public. A night victory, even a complete and decisive one, would not accomplish that. It would be too easy to explain away, too easy to attribute to luck or trickery or the dishonorable use of darkness. The subjects of the Persian Empire, from the satraps in their palace offices to the farmers in their fields, needed to be able to look at what happened at Gaugamela and understand, with no possibility of alternative interpretation, that the Macedonian king had faced the full power of Persia in the full light of day, and had simply, comprehensively, and irresistibly destroyed it. That required daylight. That required the open plain that Darius had so carefully prepared. That required, in the most paradoxical possible way, fighting the battle exactly where and how Darius wanted to fight it. Parmenion, to his considerable credit, accepted the decision without further argument. Whatever his private reservations, he was a professional soldier and a loyal commander. And once Alexander had made his position clear, Parmenion prepared to implement it with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. The two men, the old veteran and the young king, had a complex relationship that would end tragically, as so many of the relationships in Alexander's life did. But on this night they were united by the shared enterprise of the morning. Alexander, according to Plutarch, returned to his tent and went to sleep. This is the moment that has fascinated historians, psychologists, and military thinkers for 2,000 years. The ability to sleep, genuinely and deeply sleep, on the night before the decisive battle of your life, facing an army that outnumbered yours by a ratio of at least 2-to-1, on ground, specifically prepared to destroy you, represents a quality of psychological organization that goes beyond mere confidence or courage. The ancient sources treat it as almost miraculous. Plutarch writes that Parmenion, coming to rouse Alexander in the pre-dawn hours, found him sleeping so soundly that he had to call his name several times before receiving any response. When Alexander finally woke, reportedly showing mild irritation at being disturbed, Parmenion asked how he could have slept with such a battle ahead of him. Alexander's response, as Plutarch records it, was simple and devastating in its self-assurance. He said that he had already won, and that Darius, by assembling all his forces in one place, had finally allowed him to settle the question once and for all, rather than chasing the Persian king across the infinite distances of his empire. Modern psychologists who have studied the phenomenon of extreme performers, soldiers, athletes, surgeons, and others who must function at the highest level under conditions of extreme stress, describe a state that some researchers call pre-performance equanimity, a quality found in the most capable individuals whereby the act of thorough preparation produces genuine psychological calm in the face of imminent danger. The preparation is so complete, the mental rehearsal so thorough, that the actual event, however dangerous, becomes almost familiar before it begins. This is almost certainly what we are observing in Alexander on the night before Gaugamela. He had spent weeks, perhaps months, thinking through the battle, studying the terrain reports from his scouts, analyzing the intelligence about Persian deployments and equipment and command structures, working and reworking the tactical problem until he had found the solution that he believed would work. By the time he lay down in his tent, the battle was, in the most important sense, already over. The physical execution was merely the translation of a mental plan into physical reality. But there is another dimension to this night that deserves serious attention. And it is one that the purely military histories of Gaugamela tend to underemphasize. The men who lay awake in the Macedonian camp that night were not abstractions. They were human beings with full, complex inner lives, with fears and hopes and attachments and griefs that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy. They were men who had been away from their homes and families for 3 years, who had watched their friends die in battles from the Granicus to the walls of Tyre, who were exhausted in the deep, bone-level way that only sustained military campaigning produces. For these men, the night before Gaugamela was a reckoning. It was the night when every man made his own private accounting of what his life had been, what it might yet become, and what he was willing to risk for the king who had brought him here. Many of them, we must assume, made their peace with the possibility that the morning would bring their deaths. Many of them, we must also assume, found reasons to hope, reasons rooted in 3 years of victories and the peculiar, almost irrational confidence that Alexander seemed to generate in the men around him like heat from a fire. Parmenion, we may imagine, did not sleep at all. Alexander slept until Parmenion woke him. And when the sun rose on October 1, 331 BC, and the vast plain of Gaugamela was gradually revealed in the early morning light, the two armies looked at each other across a distance of perhaps a mile or two, and every man on both sides knew that the world was about to change. The question was only in whose image? When the Macedonian army stepped off the high ground and began its advance across the plain of Gaugamela, the first thing that every experienced Persian commander watching from the opposite side would have noticed was that something was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a mistake, wrong in the sense of unexpected, inexplicable, disorienting in the particular way that genuine military genius is always disorienting to the people on the receiving end of it, because genius in war, as in every other domain, operates by doing things that seem, in the moment, to make no sense. Alexander was moving to the right, not charging forward, not advancing straight toward the Persian center, in the kind of direct, symmetrical assault that the terrain and the force dispositions on both sides would have led any competent military observer to predict. He was leading his companion cavalry, the elite Macedonian horsemen who served as both his personal bodyguard and his primary offensive strike force, obliquely to the right, at an angle to the main axis of advance, moving laterally across the Persian front rather than directly toward it. The Persian commanders watching this would have exchanged glances. Messengers would have been dispatched to the center, to Darius on his great chariot, carrying the same puzzling intelligence the Macedonian king is moving sideways. To understand why this mattered so much, and why it represented one of the most sophisticated tactical maneuvers in the history of ancient warfare, we need to step back and look at the geometry of the battlefield as it existed in the minutes before full engagement. The Persian line was enormous. Modern historians, working from Arrian's detailed description and their own analysis of the terrain, estimate that the Persian front extended for several kilometers. The kind of frontage that only an army of truly massive size can occupy. This was, of course, entirely intentional. The extended front was designed to allow the Persian cavalry on both flanks to sweep around the ends of the shorter Macedonian line and envelop it from the rear. The classic double envelopment that military commanders from Hannibal to modern times have recognized as the most decisive form of battlefield victory. The scythed chariots were positioned in front of the Persian line on the flanks, ready to be driven forward through gaps in the Macedonian formation that the Persian cavalry attacks would create. The ground had been leveled specifically to allow them their maximum effectiveness. Everything Darius had prepared was designed to work in conjunction with everything else. A layered system of mutually supporting threats that was, on paper, almost impossible to defeat. Against this layered system, Alexander was deploying a layered response, but he was deploying it in a way that required his opponent to reveal its vulnerabilities before those responses could be applied. The oblique advance to the right was the first layer of this response, and its purpose was simultaneously tactical and psychological. On the tactical level, the rightward movement was designed to achieve two things simultaneously. First, it was carrying Alexander's companion cavalry off the leveled ground that Darius had prepared, moving toward terrain that was rougher and less suitable for the scythed chariots, whose effectiveness depended entirely on their ability to move at high speed across flat, obstacle-free ground. Second, and more importantly, it was applying a form of lateral pressure on the Persian left flank that forced a reaction. In military theory, there is a concept that modern analysts call forcing moves. Actions that constrain your opponent's options, that create situations where every available response to what you are doing creates a new vulnerability somewhere else. Alexander's oblique advance was exactly this kind of forcing move. By moving right and continuing to move right with apparent determination, he was presenting Darius with a dilemma that had no clean solution. If Darius did nothing and allowed the Macedonian right wing to continue its lateral movement, Alexander's cavalry would eventually move off the prepared ground entirely, perhaps onto terrain where the scythed chariots could not operate effectively, and would threaten to overlap the Persian left flank in a way that could roll up the entire line from the end. This was an unacceptable outcome. If Darius responded by moving his own left flank cavalry laterally to match Alexander's movement, the Persian line would begin to extend and distort, and the carefully maintained integrity of the formation would start to break down. Units moving sideways to track an opponent's lateral movement will inevitably create gaps between themselves and the units to their inside, especially if the movement continues for any sustained period. A gap in a battle line, even a small one, is an invitation to catastrophe. Every experienced commander in the ancient world knew this. The cohesion of the battle line was sacred. Once that cohesion broke, once a gap appeared, the enemy's cavalry would pour through it like water through a crack in a dam. And the organized tactical formation would become a chaos of individual men fighting for their lives with no coordination and no support. Darius understood all of this. He watched the Macedonian right wing moving steadily to his left, and he decided that Alexander had been waiting for him to make. He ordered his left flank cavalry to move. Bessus, commanding the Bactrian cavalry on the Persian left, received the order and began the lateral movement designed to counter Alexander's advance and prevent the Macedonian right wing from threatening the flank. The Bactrian horsemen were among the finest cavalry in the Persian army, tough, experienced riders from the high plains of Central Asia, who had been fighting on horseback since childhood. They moved well, maintaining reasonable cohesion as they extended leftward to match Alexander's oblique advance. And as they moved, almost imperceptibly at first and then with gathering inevitability, the gap began to open. This is the moment, to borrow the language of the opening chapter's highlight scene, where Darius's eyes should have begun to betray the first tremor of uncertainty. Because the gap that was opening between the moving Bactrian cavalry on his left and the more stationary units of his center. That gap was not a random accident of battlefield chaos. It was a deliberate, engineered consequence of a plan that Alexander had designed with extraordinary precision. A plan that had been working from the first step of the oblique advance, visible only to the man who had designed it and not yet to the man it was designed to destroy. But before that gap could be exploited, before Alexander could turn the forcing move into the decisive strike, he had to deal with the scythed chariots. Darius, watching his left flank cavalry moving to counter the Macedonian rightward drift, made a decision that was tactically logical, but operationally premature. He ordered the scythed chariots to advance. The chariots were, in theory, terrifying weapons. Each vehicle was fitted with long, curved blades extending from the wheel axles at approximately knee height, designed to carve through the legs of infantry formations as the chariots drove at high speed through the ranks. Against troops who broke or scattered, they were devastating. Against troops who held their ground, maintained their formation, and executed a pre-planned defensive response, they were considerably less effective. Alexander had planned for the chariots, the Macedonian infantry, who formed the phalanx, those blocks of men carrying the 18-foot Susa pikes that had revolutionized ancient warfare under Philip II, had been instructed in a specific defensive technique. When the chariots came, certain units would open lanes, deliberate gaps in the formation wide enough for the chariots to pass through harmlessly, while other units closed around the chariot teams from both sides. Light infantry, the javelin throwers and archers who operated in advance of the phalanx, were positioned to target the chariot horses from the flanks. The execution was not perfect. Nothing in the chaos of battle ever is. Several of the chariots reached the Macedonian infantry and caused real casualties. Injuries that Arrian describes with the matter-of-fact directness of someone drawing on eyewitness accounts. But the chariot charge did not shatter the Macedonian phalanx. It did not create the panic and disintegration that Darius had designed it to create. The phalanx bent, absorbed the impact, and held. And while the chariots were failing to achieve their intended effect, Alexander was watching the gap. It was there, between the Bactrian cavalry that Bessus had moved leftward to counter his advance, and the inner units of the Persian center that had remained relatively stationary. There was now a space. Not enormous, not the kind of obvious, unmissable opening that a less sophisticated tactical observer might wait for. It was subtle, a thinning of the Persian formation, a relative absence of bodies and horses in a specific section of the line that had been thicker moments before. But it was enough. In the 23 years since he had first sat on a horse and learned the difference between a walk and a canter in the hills outside Pella, the capital of Macedonia, in the 15 years since his father Philip had begun teaching him the fundamentals of military command, in the 3 years since the Granicus had proven that the lessons had been learned, Alexander had been training his eye, his instincts, and his reflexes for exactly this moment. The recognition of opportunity in battle, the ability to see the gap when it opens and respond immediately, before it closes, before the opponent adjusts, before the moment passes. This is the quality that separates merely competent commanders from transcendent ones. Alexander turned to his companion cavalry. The heteroi, the companions, were approximately 2,000 of the finest horsemen in the Macedonian army, organized into 8 squadrons, called Eli, each of approximately 200 to 250 men. They had ridden with Alexander from the beginning of the campaign. Many of them had known him since childhood. They were not merely soldiers following a commander, they were, in the most meaningful possible sense, his brothers, men who had shared the full arc of 3 years of extraordinary experience, who trusted him with a completeness that transcended rational calculation. He formed them into the wedge. The wedge formation, or emballon in Greek, was a specific tactical configuration designed for penetrating into gaps in an enemy line. Rather than advancing on a broad front, which distributes impact across a wide area and allows the opponent to resist with mass, the wedge concentrates all of its force at a single point, the apex, and drives that point into the weakest spot in the enemy formation with maximum velocity and momentum. It is the military equivalent of a needle, and like a needle, its effectiveness depends entirely on being aimed at precisely the right point. Alexander placed himself at the apex of the wedge. He rode at its tip, personally, his magnificent armor blazing in the afternoon sun, the purple cloak streaming behind him, the sarissa in his hand. This was not symbolic, it was not theatrical, it was operationally necessary. In the ancient world, the leader at the front of a cavalry charge was the spear tip, the vector of greatest concentrated force, and the first to make contact with the enemy. To lead from the front was not courageous posturing, it was the most effective way to direct the point of maximum energy, at the precise spot that had been identified as the point of maximum vulnerability. And yet, and this is the detail that should make every person reading or watching this pause for a moment of genuine reflection, it was also extraordinarily dangerous. Alexander was not directing the battle from a position of safety. He was not on a hill behind the lines, watching through binoculars, giving orders via radio. He was at the very tip of the spear, the first man. The Persians would encounter the target of every javelin and arrow and sword that the defenders of the gap could bring to bear. He was 25 years old. He had a kingdom to govern, a campaign to complete, a world to transform. And he chose, every single time, to be the first man into the gap. The wedge accelerated. The horses, trained for exactly this kind of explosive, sustained charge, moved from trot to canter to gallop in a matter of seconds. The thunder of their hooves building to a crescendo that Arrian describes as audible above the general chaos of the battle. The wedge drove into the thinned section of the Persian line, the gap that Bessus's lateral movement had created, the gap that Alexander had engineered through the oblique advance. The gap that was the culmination of a plan conceived weeks before and executed with millimeter precision on the day. The Persian units at the edge of the gap tried to close it. Some of them succeeded locally, buying seconds and meters of resistance before the weight and velocity of the companion cavalry overwhelmed them. Others fell back, disrupted by the sheer physical impact of 2,000 heavy horses moving at full gallop in a concentrated formation. The gap widened rather than closed, each Macedonian success, creating new disorder in the adjacent Persian units, the disruption cascading outward from the point of penetration like a shockwave. And Alexander, at the apex of his wedge, his eyes fixed on the center of the Persian line, on the royal chariot and the king who sat upon it, drove forward. The trap that Darius had designed, the perfect killing field, the leveled plain and the scythed chariots and the overwhelming numbers, was being sprung, and it was springing in exactly the wrong direction. The giant had built his killing field. He had assembled his army and prepared his ground and waited for the moment to crush the young man who had dared to challenge the eternal order of the world. The young man had walked into the killing field, found the one crack in the giant's armor, and driven a spear through it. What happened in the next few minutes would determine whether the crack was deep enough to reach the heart. Close your eyes for a moment and try to hold this image in your mind. A wedge of 2,000 heavy cavalry, the finest horsemen in the Macedonian army, moving at full gallop across a plain that has been shaking with the noise and violence of battle for the better part of an hour. At the absolute tip of that wedge, the apex of the diamond, riding a black horse named Bucephalus that he has owned since he was a boy of 13, is a 25-year-old king in blazing armor. And he is not looking at the thousands of Persian soldiers between him and his objective. He is looking past them. He is looking at one man, one chariot, one point in the vast geography of the battlefield, and everything else, the noise, the dying, the chaos, the mathematical improbability of what he is attempting, has been reduced to irrelevance by the absolute, singular focus of his intention. This is the charge to the throne. This is the moment that Gaugamela has been building toward since Darius first chose this plain and smoothed its stones and assembled his hundreds of thousands. This is the convergence of every decision made by every actor in this story. The culmination of 3 years of campaigning and 2 years of Persian preparation and 25 years of a young man's relentless, almost inhuman self-formation into an instrument of war and will and historical transformation. And it is about to come down to a single question, not a tactical question, not a strategic question, but a profoundly human one. When Alexander's eyes meet Darius's eyes across the narrowing distance of the battlefield, which man will look away first? The answer to that question will determine who rules the world. To understand the charge fully, we need to understand the exact tactical situation at the moment. Alexander turned his companion cavalry toward the Persian center, because the genius of what he did is inseparable from the specific geometry of the battlefield at that particular instant. As we established in Chapter 3, the oblique advance to the right had achieved its intended effect with remarkable precision. Bessus, commanding the Bactrian cavalry on the Persian left, had moved his forces laterally to counter Alexander's rightward drift. And that movement had created the gap, subtle but real, between the Persian left-wing cavalry and the inner units of the center. The wedge formation of the heteroi had penetrated that gap, driving into the thin section of the Persian line with the concentrated force that only a disciplined cavalry charge in tight formation can generate. But here is the tactical complexity that most popular accounts of Gaugamela tend to simplify away. And it is a complexity worth dwelling on because it reveals just how extraordinary Alexander's battlefield awareness was in those moments. The gap was not a clear highway to Darius. The Persian center was not empty. Between Alexander's advancing wedge and the royal chariot at the heart of the Persian formation stood thousands of men. Infantry and cavalry intermingled in the particular chaos that a hard-fought ancient battle always produces after its first hour, including some of the finest soldiers in the Persian army. The royal bodyguard, the 10,000 immortals who served as the elite infantry of the Achaemenid military, were positioned specifically to protect the king. Persian cavalry units that had not yet been committed to the flanking actions were present in depth behind the point of penetration. This was not, in other words, a situation where Alexander simply found an open door and rode through it. He found a crack, drove his wedge into the crack to widen it, and then had to continue widening it through sustained, violent, close-quarters combat against determined opposition, all while maintaining the coherence of his formation and the direction of his advance. Arrian's account of this phase of the battle, drawing on Ptolemy's first-hand description, uses language that conveys its extraordinary intensity. He writes of the fighting at the point of penetration as hand-to-hand combat of exceptional ferocity, the Macedonian cavalry, using their longer spears to advantage against the Persian defenders. The sheer momentum of the wedge formation carrying it forward even as individual riders fell and the gaps in the formation were filled by those behind. It was, in the most literal possible sense, a battering ram made of living men and horses, and it was working. But it was working slowly. And somewhere in the tactical calculus of those desperate minutes, Alexander was performing a continuous real-time assessment of how much time he had, how quickly the gap was widening, how much farther Darius was, and how long the rest of his army could hold before the weight of Persian numbers on the flanks and center began to produce irreversible damage. That last consideration brings us to the most painful and underappreciated dimension of the entire Battle of Gaugamela, the crisis on the Macedonian left. While Alexander was driving his wedge toward the Persian center, something was going wrong on the other side of the battlefield that threatened to make his charge not a masterstroke of tactical genius but the last heroic gesture of a destroyed army. The Macedonian left flank, commanded by Parmenion, was in serious trouble. Parmenion's position had been difficult from the beginning of the battle. The Persian right wing, commanded by Mazius, one of Darius's most capable and experienced commanders, had launched a powerful cavalry assault against the Macedonian left that the Thessalian cavalry and allied Greek infantry were struggling to contain. Mazius, unlike Bessus on the Persian left, had not been drawn into the lateral movement that created the decisive gap. He had attacked directly, with force and persistence, and his attack was working. The ancient sources are specific about the severity of this crisis. Diodorus Siculus writes that the Persian cavalry on the right wing broke through the Macedonian left flank entirely at one point, driving deep enough into the Macedonian rear to reach the baggage train, the supply wagons and equipment that followed every ancient army and represented not merely material value but enormous psychological significance. The sound of fighting in the baggage train, the knowledge that the enemy was behind you as well as in front of you, was the kind of thing that could turn disciplined soldiers into a panicking mob within minutes. Quintus Curtius Rufus provides perhaps the most vivid description of this moment in his History of Alexander, writing that the troops guarding the baggage were overwhelmed and that Persian cavalry rode through the Macedonian rear, releasing prisoners who had been held there, including, in a detail of almost cinematic irony, some of the Persian noblewomen captured after the Battle of Issus, Darius's own family members who had been traveling with the Macedonian army. Those women, according to Curtius, had to be physically prevented from joining the Persian cavalry attack on the baggage, so convinced were they that Darius had come to rescue them. This detail, the released prisoners, the confused fighting in the baggage train, the sound of battle behind the Macedonian lines, gives you the clearest possible sense of how desperate the situation on the left had become. This was not a contained tactical problem. This was a crisis that threatened the cohesion of the entire Macedonian position. Parmenion sent a messenger to Alexander. The content of that message, preserved in all four major ancient sources, though with slight variations in wording, was essentially, "We are being overwhelmed on the left. We need help, come now." The message reached Alexander at the worst possible moment, or depending on your perspective, at the most revealing possible moment. He was deep in the penetration of the Persian center, his wedge driving steadily toward Darius. The royal chariot visible across a narrowing distance that was measured now in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. He was, in the most literal possible sense, within reach of the decisive blow. The strike at the head of the Persian command structure that his entire tactical plan had been designed to deliver. And he was being asked to stop and turn around. What happened next is the subject of genuine historical debate, and the different ancient sources give slightly different accounts that reflect both the confusion of the actual event and the varying perspectives of their sources. Arrian, drawing on Ptolemy, who was present, gives the account that most modern historians find most credible. He writes that Alexander received the message and made an immediate decision, but that the decision was not the one Parmenion had requested. He did not turn around. He did not divert the companion cavalry to the relief of the left flank. He accelerated. The reasoning, as Arrian reconstructs it, was the same ruthless tactical logic that had governed every decision Alexander had made since the battle began. If the charge to the Persian center succeeded, if Darius was reached and either killed or driven from the field, the entire Persian army would collapse regardless of what was happening on the flanks. A Persian victory on the left wing would be irrelevant if Darius were dead or fleeing. The fastest way to save Parmenion's position was not to ride to his rescue but to destroy the command structure that was directing the forces pressing him. It was cold logic. It was the kind of decision that requires a man to hold two things simultaneously in his mind: the immediate, visceral urgency of his comrades dying on his left, and the longer, cooler calculus of the battle as a whole. It required, in short, the willingness to accept that some of your men would die in the time it took you to win the battle, and that this was the right choice. Not the comfortable choice, not the emotionally satisfying choice. The right choice. Alexander drove forward. The Persian units defending the approach to Darius's chariot were fighting with the particular desperate courage of men who understood exactly what was at stake. These were not conscript levies pressed into service from the far corners of the empire. The men surrounding Darius were the cream of Persian nobility and military service. Men whose families had served the Achaemenid throne for generations, men for whom the defense of the king was not merely a military duty but the defining obligation of their entire social and cultural identity. They fought accordingly. Arrian records that the fighting in this phase was among the most intense of the entire battle, the Persian guards throwing themselves against the Macedonian wedge with a ferocity that temporarily slowed its advance and produced significant casualties among the heteroi. Several of Alexander's closest companions, men he had known since childhood, were wounded or killed in these minutes. The ancient sources mention specifically that a man riding directly beside Alexander was killed, close enough that his blood would have reached the king. But the wedge held. The momentum, built over hundreds of meters of sustained gallop, and the tremendous psychological force of Alexander's personal presence at its tip, was not something that courage alone, however extraordinary, could stop. The Persian defenders were fighting against not just 2,000 horses and riders, but against the accumulated kinetic energy of a formation that had been accelerating since Alexander first turned its nose toward the center of the Persian line. And then, through the press of fighting men and dying horses, Alexander could see him. Darius III, King of Kings, standing in his great royal chariot, was perhaps 200 meters away. Maybe less. Close enough that Alexander could see the royal standard clearly, close enough to make out the shape of the man beneath it. Close enough that the charioteer standing beside the king would have been visible as a distinct figure. What passed between the two men in those seconds, across the chaos and carnage of the battlefield, we cannot know. The ancient sources are unanimous that Darius could see Alexander clearly, that the Macedonian king's distinctive armor, the purple cloak, and the blazing point of his sarissa made him unmistakable even in the chaos. They are equally unanimous that this visual contact, this moment of direct, personal confrontation between the two kings across the narrowing gap of the battlefield, was the pivotal moment of the entire engagement. Arrian writes that Darius had been standing his ground, directing the battle from his chariot, maintaining the presence that was essential to the continued coherence of his army's will to fight. He had been doing this throughout the battle, a fact that deserves recognition, because it contradicts the simplistic portrait of Darius as a man who ran at the first sign of danger. He had stayed, he had commanded. He had watched his left-wing cavalry pulled out of position by Alexander's oblique advance, had ordered the chariots forward, had directed Mazius to press the attack on the Macedonian left, all while the situation in his center deteriorated around him. He had, in other words, been a commander. Not a perfect commander, not a commander who found the solution to the tactical problem Alexander had set him, but a man doing his job under conditions of extreme pressure with intelligence and professional determination. But now Alexander was 200 meters away and coming at full gallop. And the Persian guards between them were failing. And the king of the world's greatest empire faced the most consequential choice of his life. To understand what happened next, and why it happened, we need to spend a moment with the psychology of ancient command. Because it is different in crucial ways from anything that modern military experience prepares us to imagine. In the ancient world, the king did not merely command the army. In a very real, deeply felt cultural and psychological sense, the king was the army. His presence on the battlefield was not a matter of personal courage, though it required that too. It was a matter of metaphysics. The Persian army fought beneath the divine sanction of the Achaemenid throne. And the Achaemenid throne was embodied, literally and symbolically, in the person of the king on his chariot at the center of the line. As long as the king stood, the army had a reason to stand. As long as the royal standard flew over that chariot, every Persian soldier on that battlefield, from the Bactrian cavalry on the left to Mazius's riders on the right, from the immortals around the chariot to the Greek mercenaries in the center, had a focal point for his will. An answer to the question that every man in a desperate battle eventually asks himself, why am I still here? They were there because the king was there. The king's presence answered the question before it could become paralyzing. Now the king's presence was creating a different kind of question. Now the king's presence was making him a target, the single most important target on the battlefield, the elimination of which would render every other tactical consideration instantly irrelevant. And Alexander was 50 meters closer than he had been 30 seconds ago. The charioteer, according to several ancient sources, was already urging the horses to move. The men of the royal bodyguard, those who were still standing and still fighting, were beginning to look over their shoulders rather than at their opponents. The involuntary, instinctive movement of men whose peripheral awareness is registering the approach of something they cannot stop. Darius looked at Alexander. Alexander, by every account, was looking directly at him. What moved first is impossible to know with certainty across 23 centuries of distance. Whether it was a rational decision, a calculated assessment that the battle was lost and that the king's survival was now the most important military objective remaining, or whether it was something more primitive. The ancient, animal response to extreme physical threat that operates below the level of rational calculation. The ancient sources do not specify and cannot agree. What they agree on is the result. The chariot turned. Plutarch writes that Darius was the first to turn and flee, a phrase whose emphasis on first is significant. It places the initiative of the retreat with Darius himself rather than with any external pressure or collapse of his guard. Arrian is careful to note that the Persian guards around the chariot were still fighting when the king turned, that the flight was not the result of being physically overrun, but preceded that overrunning, and that Darius chose to go before he was forced to go. This distinction matters enormously. A king driven from the field by irresistible physical force is a king who lost a battle. A king who chose to leave while his guards were still fighting is something more complicated and more damaging, because his departure was not compelled, but elected. And every man on the Persian side who saw or heard of it in the minutes that followed would have had to find his own answer to the question that the king's departure made suddenly unanswerable. Why are we still here? The chariot moved east, away from the fighting, toward the safety of the open plain behind the Persian lines. The royal standard, that blazing symbol around which the entire Persian military identity had been organized for 2 centuries, began to move away from the center of the battle, and then the center began to follow it. There is a phenomenon in military history that has been observed across centuries and cultures and levels of military sophistication, from the ancient world to the modern, that historians and military analysts sometimes call catastrophic cascade failure. It is the process by which an army that has been fighting with discipline and determination suddenly and almost simultaneously loses its coherence across its entire front. Not because of any single tactical defeat but because of the collapse of the psychological framework that has been holding individual courage in organized, collective form. The trigger is almost always the same. It is the moment when the soldiers on a battlefield, individually and then collectively, lose the answer to the question, why are we still here? For the Persian army at Gaugamela, that moment came when the royal standard began moving east. The collapse was not instantaneous. Armies never dissolve all at once, and the Persian force at Gaugamela contained enough disciplined, professional soldiers to ensure that the disintegration was messy and prolonged rather than clean and immediate. On the right wing, Mazius and his cavalry were still pressing hard against Parmenion's position, still unaware of, or unwilling to acknowledge what was happening at the center. The Greek mercenaries in the Persian center fought on with professional tenacity even as the units around them began to dissolve. Individual pockets of resistance continued to form and fight throughout the late afternoon. But the core of the Persian army, the mass of men who had been holding the center and whose will to continue fighting was anchored in the presence and authority of the king, felt the anchor lift and felt themselves begin to drift. Arrian describes the retreat with the controlled, precise language that characterizes his best writing, the Persian center breaking away from the Macedonians in front of them, units turning not in organized withdrawal, but in the purposeless, individual movement of men who have decided, each on his own, that there is no longer a reason to stay. The sound of an army dissolving is unlike any other sound in human experience. The particular combination of shouting and running and the dropping of equipment that cannot be carried fast enough, a sound that every veteran of ancient warfare would have recognized immediately as the sound of defeat becoming rout. The Persian right wing, Mazius's cavalry, which had been on the verge of breaking through Parmenion's position entirely, received the news of Darius's flight in the way that such news always travels through a battle, in fragments, through rumor and the distant sight of the royal standard moving the wrong direction, through the suddenly changed behavior of units in the center that they could see across the battlefield. Mazius, to his credit as a commander, maintained enough control over his cavalry to conduct what might be called a fighting withdrawal rather than a pure rout. And this relative coherence on the Persian right would have significant consequences for the final chapter of the battle. But the battle itself was decided. The Persian center had broken. The king had fled. The empire that had ruled the known world for 200 years had, in the space of perhaps 90 minutes of fighting, lost the military foundation on which all its other power rested. Alexander, driving east in pursuit of Darius's chariot, received Parmenion's second messenger in those minutes of apparent triumph. And the message was worse than the first. The left wing was not merely under pressure. It was close to destruction. The pursuit of Darius, the chase that could have ended the war in the next hour with the capture or death of the Persian king, had to be weighed against the survival of the men who had fought and bled alongside Alexander for 3 years, men who had been with him from the Granicus, who were now dying on the left wing of a battle they had already won. This is the human heart of Gaugamela, and it is the moment that reveals something about Alexander that the purely military histories of his campaign often miss. Behind the tactical genius and the personal courage and the visionary ambition, there was a man who understood, at some deep level, what he owed the people who had given him everything. He turned away from Darius, not immediately, and not without cost. The ancient sources suggest that he continued the pursuit for some distance before turning, that the decision was made in genuine anguish rather than clinical detachment. Arrian notes that during the pursuit phase, the fighting between the Macedonian cavalry and the retreating Persian units was intense and costly, and that Alexander lost men even in the pursuit. Even in what should have been the clean, victorious closing phase of a battle already won. But he turned. He rode west toward the sound of Parmenion's crisis, driving his exhausted cavalry into the Persian right wing that was already beginning to crumble under the weight of its own army's collapse. The relief of the left wing, when it came, was not the dramatic rescue of a force on the point of destruction, but the final blow against a Persian right wing that had been holding on through sheer professional tenacity and now, with the news of the center's collapse, and the king's flight confirmed, had no more reason to hold. Mazius's cavalry broke. The Macedonian left wing, battered and depleted and exhausted, held its ground and then began to advance. The Battle of Gaugamela was over. Darius was somewhere to the east, riding hard toward Media, his empire collapsing behind him. His family still in Macedonian hands, his dream of the perfect killing field reduced to the dust and blood of the plain he had so carefully prepared. Alexander stood in the center of the battlefield as the sun moved toward the western horizon, and the world that existed when that day began no longer existed. It had been replaced by something new, something that had no name yet, but that would eventually be called the Hellenistic world. A civilization born in the blood and dust of a smooth plain in northern Mesopotamia, on the day a 25-year-old king found the crack in the giant's armor and drove his spear through it. The giant was still breathing. Darius would survive, would attempt to rebuild, would reach out to Alexander with proposals of peace and alliance in the months that followed. But everyone who had been on that plain, Persian and Macedonian alike, understood what had happened with a clarity that needed no interpretation. The world had a new owner, and he was riding east, toward the horizon, unwilling even in victory to let the chase end while there was still daylight left to ride. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has no equivalent in ordinary human experience. It is the loneliness of a man who was, until very recently, the most powerful person on the face of the earth, who commanded the loyalty of 50 million subjects across 3 continents, whose word was law from the Aegean coast to the borders of India, who was addressed by everyone who came into his presence as the King of Kings, the Lord of all nations, the living embodiment of divine authority on earth, and who is now riding through the darkness of a Mesopotamian night, alone except for a handful of surviving cavalry, with the dust of his destroyed army still on his clothes and the sound of Macedonian hoofbeats still, or so it must have felt, just behind him in the dark. Darius III survived the Battle of Gaugamela. He rode east with whatever cavalry he could gather in the immediate aftermath of the collapse, crossed the Zagros Mountains into Media, and reached the city of Ecbatana, modern Hamadan in northwestern Iran, in the days following the battle. He was alive, he was free, and he still commanded the nominal loyalty of the eastern satrapies of his empire. Those vast territories of Bactria and Sogdia and Parthia that lay beyond the immediate reach of Alexander's advancing army. By any reasonable measure, he should have been able to rebuild. The Eastern Empire alone represented resources and manpower that dwarfed what Alexander commanded. Time and distance were on his side. Alexander was deep in hostile territory, operating at the end of supply lines that stretched thousands of kilometers back to Macedonia, commanding an army that had been fighting continuously for 3 years and was, by any rational assessment, overdue for exhaustion and diminishing returns. But something had happened at Gaugamela that could not be undone by distance or time or the reassembly of armies, and Darius, riding east through the autumn night, understood it. Even if he could not yet fully articulate what it was, the idea had broken. Not the Persian army, though that had broken too. Not the Persian administrative structure, though that was fracturing rapidly as satraps across the empire began. The delicate, self-interested calculations of men who sense that the political weather is changing and wish to be found on the right side of it when the change completes. Not even the Persian throne itself, which Darius still nominally occupied and which still commanded a formal claim on the loyalty of his subjects. What had broken was the Persian idea, that deep, culturally embedded conviction that had been the true foundation of Achaemenid power for 2 centuries. The belief, held by tens of millions of people across an enormous geographic and cultural span, that the Achaemenid throne was the natural, divinely ordained, and ultimately invincible center of the civilized world. The belief that the King of Kings could not be defeated on his own ground, on ground he had chosen and prepared, with every advantage of numbers and terrain and preparation on his side. Gaugamela had not merely defeated that idea. It had demonstrated, in the most public and unambiguous possible way, that the idea was simply false. And once an idea of that kind is demonstrated to be false, once the evidence against it has been presented on a scale large enough that no amount of reinterpretation or excuse-making can explain it away, it does not recover. It does not diminish gradually and gracefully. It collapses, all at once, like a building whose load-bearing wall has been removed. This is what Alexander had understood when he refused the night attack. This is what he had been fighting for. Not territory, not gold, not the satisfaction of military victory for its own sake. He had been fighting for the collapse of the idea, and Gaugamela had delivered it. The consequences were immediate, sweeping, and in some cases almost surreal in their rapidity. Babylon fell without a fight. This fact, so astonishing in its implications that it deserves to be stated plainly and allowed to sit for a moment before any explanation is attempted, tells you more about what Gaugamela actually accomplished than any amount of tactical analysis. Babylon was the greatest city in the ancient world by many measures. A metropolis of perhaps 200,000 people, surrounded by walls of legendary thickness and height that had resisted siege and assault for centuries. Garrisoned by a substantial military force, and possessed of resources that could have sustained a prolonged defense. When Alexander's army arrived before its walls in October of 331 BC, barely 3 weeks after Gaugamela, the gates opened. Mazius, the same Persian commander who had come so close to breaking Parmenion's left flank during the battle, had reached Babylon ahead of Alexander's advance and had been its governor. He came out to meet Alexander not with an army but with a delegation, bearing gifts and offering submission. The city's Babylonian priests, the ancient and politically sophisticated religious establishment that had been navigating the complexities of imperial politics since long before the Persians arrived, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. The population, whose relationship with their Persian overlords had never been uncomplicated, greeted the Macedonian army with a reception that ancient sources describe as genuinely enthusiastic. Within days of Gaugamela, the greatest city in the world had changed hands without a drop of blood being spilled, and it had done so not because it lacked the means to resist, but because the idea that made resistance feel necessary and meaningful had evaporated. Susa followed weeks later, its enormous treasury, containing, according to ancient sources, some 50,000 talents of silver and gold, a sum so vast it is difficult to translate into modern equivalents without the numbers losing their meaning, surrendered along with the city itself. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire, the city of magnificent palace complexes and the royal tombs of Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius I, fell in January of 330 BC. The speed of this collapse, city after city, treasure after treasure, satrap after satrap, making his calculations and sending his submission, was not primarily a military phenomenon. Armies did not conquer these places. The idea conquered them. The idea that the Achaemenid order had been replaced by something new, something that had demonstrated at Gaugamela. A quality that the Persian system could not match and could not explain, a quality that we might call, with careful acknowledgement of its complexity, the force of one man's absolute conviction. Meeting the brittleness of an order that had stopped questioning itself. But not everything that followed Gaugamela was clean or noble or easily reconciled with the portrait of Alexander as the enlightened conqueror, bringing a better order to replace the old one. Persepolis burns. This is the fact that every serious reckoning with Alexander's legacy has to confront. And it is worth dwelling on at length because it illuminates something important about the man and about the nature of the historical transformation he was driving. In the late winter of 330 BC, after Alexander had occupied Persepolis and secured its treasury, the magnificent palace complex of the Achaemenid kings, one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, containing throne rooms and audience halls and private apartments decorated with reliefs of extraordinary beauty and sophistication, was burned to the ground. The ancient sources disagree about whether the burning was a deliberate policy or the result of a drunken celebration that got out of hand. Arrian, characteristically careful and slightly disapproving, suggests it was a deliberate decision that Alexander later regretted. Diodorus Siculus provides a more dramatic account, describing a symposium at which Thais, an Athenian courtesan, who was the companion of Alexander's general Ptolemy, made an impassioned speech urging Alexander to burn the palace as revenge for the Persian destruction of the Athenian Acropolis in 480 BC. And Alexander, flushed with wine and the euphoria of conquest, complied. Quintus Curtius Rufus gives yet another version, more restrained in its details, but consistent in its conclusion: the palace burned, and Alexander was responsible. What all versions agree on is the aftermath. Alexander, in the cold light of morning or of sober reflection, looked at the ruins of Persepolis and understood that something irreplaceable had been destroyed. Whether or not he ordered it, whether or not Thais's speech was the proximate cause, he had presided over the destruction of a civilization's most magnificent physical expression, and he knew it. This moment matters for understanding Gaugamela's legacy, because it introduces the complexity that the simple narrative of triumphant liberation tends to obscure. Alexander was not merely replacing Persian tyranny with Macedonian benevolence. He was doing something far more disruptive and far less tidy, dismantling an entire civilizational order whose loss, whatever its political failings, represented an irreversible diminishment of something that had taken centuries to build. The world that came after Gaugamela was in many ways richer, broader, and more creatively dynamic than the world before it. The Hellenistic civilization that emerged from Alexander's conquests produced philosophy and science and art of extraordinary quality, the Library of Alexandria, the geometry of Euclid, the astronomy of Hipparchus, the sculpture of Pergamon, achievements that owed their existence to the cross-pollination of Greek and Eastern traditions that Alexander's campaigns made possible. But it also produced the ruins of Persepolis, and the scattered ashes of a culture that had been among the most sophisticated the ancient world had yet produced. Progress and destruction are not always separable. The New World and the burned palace were products of the same man, the same campaign, the same decisive hour on the plain of Gaugamela. Darius III did not live to see his empire's final absorption into Alexander's new order. His end came not on a battlefield, not in a last heroic stand against the advancing Macedonian army, but in the dust of a Bactrian road, at the hands of his own people. In the summer of 330 BC, As Alexander's pursuit intensified and the eastern satraps began to calculate that a living Darius was more of a liability than an asset, Bessus, the Bactrian commander who had led the Persian left wing at Gaugamela, organized a conspiracy among the remaining eastern satrapies. Darius was arrested by his own commanders, placed in chains, and transported in a covered wagon as the conspirators attempted to use him as a bargaining chip. Or, failing that, to eliminate him before Alexander could use a living Persian king as a symbol of legitimate succession. Alexander, receiving intelligence of Darius's capture, drove his cavalry in a pursuit of legendary intensity. Riding through the night with a reduced force of horsemen, covering distances that ancient sources describe with an admiration that suggests they were extraordinary, even by the standards of ancient cavalry operations. He was, by every account, desperate to reach Darius alive. He was too late. When the advanced elements of Alexander's cavalry finally caught up with Bessus's retreating column, they found the covered wagon abandoned by the side of the road. Inside it, pierced by multiple spear wounds, was Darius III, King of Kings, still breathing but beyond any help that the 4th century BC could offer. The ancient sources vary in their account of what happened in those final minutes. Some say Darius died before Alexander arrived. Others say Alexander reached the wagon while Darius still lived, that the two men who had defined each other across 3 years of war and 2 continents of pursuit finally met face to face, not as opposing kings on a prepared battlefield, but as a dying man and the conqueror who had not wanted him to die this way. The version in which Alexander reaches Darius alive, preserved in Plutarch and in the later Alexander Romance tradition, describes Alexander removing his own cloak and placing it over the dying king, a gesture whose symbolic weight is almost impossibly dense. The conqueror, covering the conquered with his own royal garment, the new order acknowledging the humanity of the old. Whether this is a historical fact or the romantic elaboration of later tradition, we cannot say with certainty. But it has the quality of emotional truth, the sense that it captures something real about the relationship between these two men. Even if the specific details are embellished, what we know for certain is that Alexander ordered Darius buried with full royal honors, in the manner appropriate to an Achaemenid king. He hunted down the conspirators who had murdered Darius, treating the assassination of a king as a crime that demanded justice, regardless of which king had been killed. And he mourned, or performed mourning, in a way that the ancient sources treat as genuine rather than theatrical. He was 25 years old. He had destroyed the greatest empire the world had ever seen. He had killed, or caused the death of, hundreds of thousands of people in the process. He had burned one of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed, and now he was standing over the body of the man who had been his mirror image and his defining opponent, covering him with a cloak, and ordering him buried as a king. The complexity of that moment is the complexity of Gaugamela itself, and of everything that followed from it. There is a temptation, when we reach the end of a story like this one, to wrap it in the clean, satisfying language of historical conclusion. To say and so Alexander won, and Darius lost, and the world was changed, the end. To give it the narrative closure that real history rarely possesses but that we, as human beings wired for story, instinctively crave. But Gaugamela resists that kind of closure. It demands something more from us. Because what happened on that plain on October 1, 331 BC was not merely a military event, not merely a geopolitical turning point, not merely the replacement of one empire by another in the long, largely indifferent procession of human political arrangements. It was something that touches, if you look at it carefully enough, on questions that are still alive and still unresolved in the world we inhabit today. It was a confrontation between the weight of established order and the force of individual will. Between the accumulated power of institutions that have grown so large and so certain of their own permanence that they have stopped questioning themselves, and the disruptive energy of a single person who refuses to accept that the existing order is natural or permanent or beyond challenge. Darius was not wrong to trust his advantages. By every rational calculation available to him, he should have won. He had the numbers, he had the terrain, he had the preparation, he had 2 centuries of imperial momentum behind him, the deep gravitational pull of an order so large and so old that most of the people living under it could not imagine any other way the world could be arranged. What he did not have, and could not acquire no matter how many stones he cleared from the plain of Gaugamela, was the quality that Alexander possessed in such overwhelming measure that it functioned not merely as a personal attribute but as a kind of force of nature. An absolute, bone-deep refusal to accept that the world as it existed was the world as it had to be. This is the thing about Gaugamela that speaks most directly to those of us watching from 23 centuries away. And perhaps most directly to those of us who are old enough to have accumulated our own relationship with the weight of established order. Our own experience of systems and institutions and arrangements that present themselves as permanent and inevitable and beyond the reach of any individual's will to change them. The systems are not permanent. The institutions are not inevitable. The arrangements that present themselves as the natural order of things were, every single one of them, at some point in the past. The radical imposition of someone's particular vision of how things should be, someone who was told that the existing order could not be challenged and who challenged it anyway. This does not mean that every challenge to the established order is justified or wise or good. Alexander burned Persepolis. The Hellenistic world that emerged from his conquests was magnificent in many ways and brutal in others. The transformation of the ancient world that Gaugamela set in motion produced both the Library of Alexandria and the Wars of the Diadochi. The successor conflicts that tore Alexander's empire apart after his death and killed hundreds of thousands of people in the process. Change is not automatically better. Destruction is not automatically progress. But Gaugamela reminds us, with a vividness that no amount of temporal distance can fully dim, that the arrangements we inherit are not the arrangements we are required to keep. That the giants of any age, however large they appear, however carefully they have prepared their killing fields, however thoroughly they have smoothed the ground for their own advantage, are not invincible. They have gaps in their lines. Every system has them. Every institution has them. Every established order, no matter how vast or how ancient or how thoroughly it has leveled the ground to its own advantage, has the moment where Bessus moves the cavalry laterally, and the gap opens, just slightly, for just long enough. The question that Gaugamela asks of every person who studies it seriously is not whether you have the resources or the numbers or the favorable terrain. Those things matter, but they are not decisive. The decisive question is simpler and harder and more personal than any of that. When the gap opens, will you see it? And if you see it, will you go? Alexander went. He rode at the tip of his own spear, first into the gap. First into the danger. First into the possibility that the world could be rearranged into something closer to the image of what he believed it should be. He was wrong about some things and right about others, brilliant in the ways that military history has exhaustively documented and flawed in the ways that his later campaigns and his eventual death at 32 in Babylon would make clear. He was not a perfect man. He was not a simple hero. He was a human being who, at a particular moment on a particular plain in northern Mesopotamia, on a morning in early October, with the Persian Empire arrayed against him and the rational odds firmly against his survival, made a choice that changed the world. And 2.5 millennia later, we are still talking about it. We are still studying it, still arguing about it, still drawing lessons from it, that we apply to everything from corporate strategy to personal courage to the perennial, never fully resolved question of how much any individual can change the world they inherited. That is the measure of Gaugamela, not the territory it transferred, not the treasuries it opened, not even the Hellenistic civilization it made possible, magnificent as all of those things are. The measure of Gaugamela is the conversation it has never stopped generating, the questions it has never stopped asking, the way it continues to reach across 23 centuries and touch something in us that recognizes, at a level below rational analysis, that this story is about more than ancient kings and ancient battles. It is about the moment when the world changes. It is about the question of whether you will be the person who changes it, or the person who built the killing field and watched, with eyes that could no longer hold steady, as everything they had prepared, and everything they had assumed was swept aside by something they had not been able to imagine. The dust of Gaugamela settled long ago. The plain in northern Iraq where Darius smoothed the stones is quiet now. Unremarkable from the air, indistinguishable from the thousands of square kilometers of similar terrain that surround it. The armies are gone. The chariots are gone. The blazing armor and the purple cloak and the eyes of a 25-year-old king, scanning a Persian battle line for the gap that he knew, with a certainty beyond rational calculation, had to be there. All of it is gone. But the question remains, when the gap opens, will you see it? And if you see it, will you go? In the next chapter of this series, we travel forward 6.5 centuries, from the dust of Gaugamela to the walls of the greatest city the ancient world ever built. The empire that Alexander's conquests set in motion has long since fragmented and reformed, and transformed into something he could not have imagined: a new Rome, a Christian empire. A civilization that called itself the continuation of everything Greece and Rome had built. We are going to Constantinople. We are going to May 29, 1453. The last night of a civilization that had lasted 1,000 years. The night the Emperor Constantine XI put on his armor and walked out to meet an army that outnumbered his defenders by a ratio of 20 to 1. Knowing, with a clarity that needs no explanation, that the morning was not going to bring rescue. We are going on the night the Second Rome fell. And we are going to ask the same question we asked at Gaugamela, though this time the answer will be different. When the gap opens, will you go? Constantine went, but this time, the gap opened the wrong way. That story, next time.